Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy out there. This week, we are going to continue with our exploration of the Roman Empire. So, there was no specific reading for this week. It's really a continuation of what you read before. Today, we're going to be talking about the Roman town planning and engineering in particular. So, it's going to be a little bit shorter. I'll talk a lot about architecture and urbanism, but I'm going to have you watch a video on the engineering side. Right now, I wanted to touch base on one thing from last week's lecture that I noticed in the discussion, and that is law enforcement in the ancient city of Rome. Now, a lot of you were saying that you were surprised that there was no law enforcement in ancient Rome, and there was. What I said was there was no law enforcement in the way that we would understand it. It was much more the military coming out and putting down rebellions, dealing with gangs, but a lot of the petty crime and things that we would expect law enforcement to be engaged with was not as prevalent in that time. So if you were living in the slums, there was not as much law enforcement as there was where people, more well to do people, were living. So life in the slums, in the poorer parts of the city, obviously there was not as much law and order, which is what I wanted to say that first time around. So I just wanted to clarify that for you. There was a military presence in the streets serving as law and order, but no police force as we understand it today. All right, so let's jump in. A little recap here. So the Roman Empire spanned about 1/9 of the Earth's surface, and you can see that on this map here. It was huge. It covered most of what we have studied so far. It covered three continents. It ruled at the time over a quarter of humanity. So that is a lot of people. And it governed people of different races, different religions, languages, traditions, and cultures. So, what we're going to see here, like I said before, is something very much like Persia, where they are going to try to control such a vast empire, mostly by letting people do whatever they wanted to do, but then keeping everybody under the umbrella of being Roman. And noticed somebody mentioned last week that this seemed very similar to the United States, and it should, because that's the same idea that we have or have had in this country, that we embrace people coming from all different places, all different races, languages, cultures, but then that everybody falls under the larger umbrella of being American, just like everybody would fall under the larger umbrella of being a Roman citizen. So we're going to look at different types of Roman settlements. So you have Roman cities, and we talked about the city of Rome, the capital. But you also have military camps, which are castrum or castra. You have colonias, which are Roman outposts established to conquer territory. So, say you conquered a territory, the first thing you want to do is establish a colony there to start Romanizing that land. And then you have oppidum, which are Roman commercial towns, and these are usually on the sides of roads. They're trade towns, basically. A little bit more about town planning. So, what we're going to see is the influence of both the Greeks and the Etruscans in town planning. They're going to use grid system for streets, as you can see here. They had two major streets intersecting at right angles to provide a crossroads and a focal point at the center of town. So I'm going to have it on a slide next, in the next slide, but you can see you have the Cardo and the Decumanus, which I cannot pronounce. And then you have an entrance into the town. So it's all laid out very strategically. So, Roman town planning fully integrated urban defenses with the city plan and the street system. And that is because a lot of these smaller towns are located in hostile territories that have just been colonized. And so you need to be able to defend those towns. The main streets led directly from the center of town to the gates, and you can see that here. Uh, you can see that here in this main alleyway. And then you have the Palmarial Road, which runs all the way around next to the city gates. And I want you to just think about why you would put a road all around next to the city gates. Now, if any of you are thinking for defense purposes, that's correct. This is so. If you need to defend the city, you are quickly able to get to the walls and are able to defend the city, and you're not having to climb over houses in order to get to those defense places. Now, one of the things we're going to be going over a lot of the different structures that you would find in a Roman town. And I just want to point out here, you see that the amphitheater, most of these Roman towns would have an amphitheater, the most famous of which, of course, is the Colosseum. They were usually outside of town. And that's not the case with the Colosseum itself, and that is for political purposes. The Flavian Amphitheater was built over a very unpopular Emperor Nero's palace. Right. So usually they're located outside of town. We're going to see that the Forum is usually at the center, and then you have different sorts of temples, basilicas, different locations throughout the town we're going to go through. So the first one I want to talk about is the basilica. And a lot of you have probably heard of this word and are thinking it's a Christian house of worship. But at this point, it is a civic building. The Christians are going to adopt this structure and they are going to use it for their house of worship. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we get into our next unit. But it was a public court building or a hall, and it's usually right next to the public forum, right at the center of town. It was roofed with a central nave, and that's just that main hallway that you see here. We call that a nave. It usually has columns, so it's a post and lintel construction. It's very basic, and it usually has 1 or 2 floors. So this creates a large space in which you can have public gatherings. Then you also have the temple. So the basilica and the temple are 2 different things. Now, it's based off of both Etruscan and Greek models. It's typically very frontal. If you remember the Greek temple, you can't tell which part's the front, which part's the back. It's very sculptural. The Roman temple is not like that. It's very frontal. You usually only have columns at the very front. It usually has its Corinthian columns and a flight of stairs that leads up to the main chamber, right? The cella. Now, I will mention that a lot of the examples I'll be showing to you today come from throughout the empire, because some of the best preserved Roman ruins are actually located outside of Rome and outside of Italy itself. So this comes from a temple in Tunisia. So here we have this on the left is an Etruscan temple. Then you have our Greek temple, and this is the Parthenon that we talked about. And so you can see how the Roman temple is often a mishmash of both of them. And sometimes you do find columns all around, and sometimes the columns are just at the front. Now we're going to talk about Roman engineering, because when you talk about the Romans, they didn't quite invent anything radical. Usually when we talk about the Roman arch, about concrete, about all of these types of inventions, they are actually taking them from places that they conquer. So in that way, they are learning from those local populations. What the Romans do is they just scale it at a much bigger scale. So everything is bigger, everything is grander, and everything gets built much faster. So again, here it says they applied existing repertoire on grander scale. And these slides are coming from a different university. That's why I kind of kept that logo there. So this is not my precise wording, but I thought they were pretty good. So they emphasized 3 developments that had not been used before, and that is the use of the semicircular arch, the extensive use of concrete, and the concept of public works. Right? And I'm going to go into these. So the semicircular arch allows us to create new structural shapes, as we'll see, part the aqueducts, the amphitheater. So those are all using that semicircular arch. It allows us to build spaces with less columns. The use of concrete is incredibly important because the Romans conquer so fast, they don't have time to be building stuff out of stone like the Greeks did. And so with concrete, you can build much faster. You can build faster, you can build cheaper, and then you just cover it with a little layer of stone and it looks nice and fancy. And the concept of public works is going to be used by both the Republic and especially by later emperors in order to establish the rule and to be remembered for posterity. Now, the public water supply was probably the most important thing to that the Romans did for the empire. So we often think about the Colosseum, about all of these grand buildings, the baths, but really it's public water supply, being able to move water into the city and have a safe drinking water supply that is going to be most important. Right. So the first thing we're going to talk about a little briefly is roads. So Roman roads were incredibly famous because they started building them. They built upon roads that were already existing, especially we talked about Persian roads before. They're building upon road networks that already exist, but they're going to connect them. And these roads, again, were built mostly for being able to move large military forces. And then a secondary use is for trade and travel. Right? Now, the roads were built, they're very well built roads in that, I mean, they're still in use today, some of them. Some of these bridges that the Romans built are still in use today. And the way that they built them was they put gravel and then they put a layer of stone and they bent them at the edges so that when it rained, the water would flood to the sides and you could still use the road itself. Now, when it comes to aqueducts, the city of Rome itself is going to have about 12 aqueducts. They're going to be producing about 187 gallons per minute. So Rome had a ridiculous amount of water supply for its population. People were able to bathe in the baths or have access to water much more than many modern cities today. So it had 3 times as much per day as modern New York City. It ran continuously. I want you to see where it's bringing in all that water because we talked about the population being over 1 million people. You need to be able to supply water for all of those people. And as we're going to see, the Romans loved bathing. So you also need to provide for that. Oh, here's my other slide about roads. So let's back up a little. So there were about 50,000 miles of roads in the empire, and they were used, like I said before, for military movements, for communication, and commerce. And the milestones were placed about every 1,000 paces so that you kind of knew where you were on that road. And here's a picture of one of those. All right. So I'm sorry my slides are a little bit out of order, so we're just going to go with it. So in terms of construction technique, we talked about the use of concrete. And so we're going to see that in the Pantheon, and I'm going to have you watch a video on the Pantheon. But the idea behind this very large dome in the Pantheon is that you can create it out of concrete instead of stone. And so you don't need to have a corbelled dome as we saw in ancient Greece. So what you're going to have are hollow bricks in order to lighten up the load. You have these sunken panels, which reduce the weight as well. And then they're going to mix in pumice stone and shards of pottery into the concrete in order to make it lighter. And it's much thinner at the top. And all of this is going to allow them to build with concrete over much larger surfaces without having supports like columns. All right. So here is our arch, right? So this is the semicircular arch, and the semicircular arch, I mean, it's not that mind blowing, but it is for us because all we've seen is post and lintel up to this point. And again, the Romans are not going to invent the arch, they're just going to adapt it. And what they're going to do is you have all of these stones and you have the keystone right here at the center. Now, this is not self sustaining, meaning that you do need a support structure on the sides, otherwise the arch collapses. When I had this class in person, sometimes I would bring in sugar cubes and people would make little arches out of sugar cubes, and that's to explain a little bit of the physics and the engineering behind them. But you can see in this aqueduct that you have the other arch also supporting this inner arch right here. Now, in terms of aqueducts, aqueducts are water distribution systems. So they are the way that they were able to bring in all of that water into the city of Rome and other towns and cities. So aqueducts move water solely through gravity. So you're bringing water up from usually the mountains or a supply higher up, and then you slowly decrease the altitude of the aqueduct in order to have the water flow down. Now, most aqueducts are actually built underground, but when you have to go through a space where there's a change in elevation, then you need to build this overground aqueducts. And this one is in Seville in Spain. It's from around 1 AD, I believe. And up until recently, there was still water flowing through this aqueduct. So it is huge and it has withstood the test of time. Now, in terms of the underground aqueducts, they're usually made out of concrete or lead, which I know is not particularly healthy, but they use those to move the water supply quite efficiently. All right. So this is the one I was talking to you. It says it was in service until 1900, and then I had a student ask me, and it actually turns out they were using it just very recently. So now, a little bit about the Cloaca Maxima, and I just briefly mentioned this at the beginning of last week. This probably started as a natural water source, but then in the 6th century before the Common Era, it was probably built into a drainage channel. Right? Now, during the time of Augustus, it was covered up, and it was built to drain the low-lying lands that ran through the forum. So it was used for drainage. And then it slowly started to be connected to homes. And again, these are the villas, so these are not the apartment complexes. And it emptied into the Tiber River, which sounds very healthy. But remember when I said all about those indoor toilets? I mean, they're not modern toilets, but outhouses basically in the villas. They all drained out into the Cloaca Maxima, and scientists and archaeologists actually love going into the Cloaca Maxima because you find all sorts of items that were kind of thrown down the toilet, and people actually do a lot of scientific research on ancient Roman poop to find out what people ate and where they were coming from and all sorts of interesting things. So we are lucky to still have the Cloaca Maxima. Now, one of the places that was most important that I mentioned earlier were the Roman baths. And that is because the baths were very different than what we would consider like a pool. It's not a pool, it's a place where you would bathe, but it was also a social space. So the baths were open to everyone. Now, that did not mean that you would necessarily come in at the same time as the patricians if you were a plebeian, but you still had access to the same building because these were usually public works that were open to the whole population. And the baths were where you would go if you wanted to clean yourself, but also where you would go for some social networking. Like if you wanted to meet somebody that could give you a job, you would do this naked in the baths. We have established at this point that the Romans had a very different relationship with nudity than we did, right? Based off the public toilets. This would also be where you might actually go to have a class. So, like, we might be having class in the Roman baths. This would also be where you could pick up your sex worker. This would also be where poets would recite poetry. You would have musicians. You would have salon parlors here. So they were kind of community centers. And I'm going to have you watch a video on one of the most famous Roman baths. But the main purpose for aqueducts was really to support the baths because you have a lot of water needed to fill the baths. And Romans had a passion for the baths, not only because of cleanliness and hygiene, but also just because these were very social spaces. And here you have a little bit of a diagram where you can see the pools. Some of these pools were heated, and how they were heated was through human power. And so you have slaves underneath the bath floors that are heating the pools. So you have all stations of society really represented at the baths. This is the baths at Caracalla, which is the video you're going to watch in a few minutes. Now, moving on to the amphitheater, because this is one where a lot of people are interested. Of course, you think of the Colosseum in the city of Rome, but there were actually amphitheaters in most medium to large cities, and this is in Arles, France. Now, these were venues for watching gladiatorial fights, public executions, or animal fights. So they were both for entertainment purposes and they were also for social control. You would have mock naval battles that would be enacted, animal performances. It always depended kind of on the size of your city. They were usually constructed, like I said, outside of the city walls, right on the edge, except with the exception of Rome and a couple of others. You also had military amphitheaters, ludi, that were built near forts and fortresses, and these served as training grounds for soldiers. Now, this is the very famous Colosseum, and as you can see here, what we have is the remains of the original Colosseum. The original Colosseum had a retractable roof. It had the floor here that you can see here would have been covered, and what you're seeing here is where those gladiators and animals would wait to come up to fight. You also have all of the flooring here, which is no longer there. And there was definitely, we call the Colosseum a microcosm of Roman society, that meaning like a miniature version of Roman society, in that where you got to sit talked a lot about your social standing. Now, we talked about senators or the emperor, depending on what time period you're talking about. They had the highest social standing, patricians. So they would get to sit at the very front. Then you had equestrians, military personnel. Then you would have uh, middle class workers, so that baker, those clerks, middle class people. And then you would have your plebeians, and then behind them you would have women and slaves, and they would be all the way at the very top in the nosebleed sections of the Colosseum. Now, if you think being in the nosebleed section is the worst thing that could happen to you, actually being in the arena is the worst thing that could happen to you. Now, gladiators themselves, some of these were prisoners of war, and others chose to become gladiators because of the prestige. This was a very glamorous life, a very short life, and they were aware of that. But if you were good at being a gladiator, you could become famous and you could make a lot of money and you could live for the adrenaline of the fight. So many people chose to become gladiators. Others, of course, like I said, were forced into it. And what we see in the arena is really a fight, a metaphorical fight between Romans and foreigners and outsiders, those that choose not to be Roman, between the Romans, the civilized, and the barbarians. Right? So just keep that in mind. Now, like I said, all my slides are out of order. But here we have Pompeii, and we see a major street fair. And this is a little bit about what I talked when I said town planning was very strategic. It was on a grid system. And you can see that here, like I said, Pompeii is one of those places that has been left untouched by later civilizations. And so we can kind of see what it was like originally. I'm going to skip some of these. And then I have two examples, one coming from Palmyra in Syria and the other one from Apamea in Syria. And these were those main streets that you can see. I think they're in another slide at the very front of this lecture. But we talked about those main thoroughfares that intersected, and those are here. Now, unfortunately, I brought in this slide because I wanted to talk a little bit about the destruction of ancient Roman and other cultures that we've looked at. Now, many of you have probably heard about this already, but during the occupation of ISIS in Syria, there was a massive destruction of Roman and other cultures' heritage, and among them these sites. So some of these sites have been destroyed, and all we have now today are pictures of them. So that's very unfortunate. But part of what we have to keep in mind when we think about these ancient sites, some of them are still with us, some of them have been destroyed. And when we think about reconstruction, we often think of how that can be done in a way that is respectful to cultures, but is also protective of the artifacts themselves. Right? Like I said, many of the artifacts that were able to be saved are no longer, unfortunately, in Syria. And the goal, of course, would be to return them to Syria at some point. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is after this week, next week, you don't have any readings. So you're going to be turning in your parts of your art boards online, and I'll have a section for you to turn those in. But we're going to quickly shift from the end of the Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire and to the medieval world. And so I'm going to use next week to really talk about that transition, to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, at least in the West, and what that means for art. And I just brought these two images to kind of show you where we're going and how we get from hyper-realistic Roman art to the art of the Middle Ages, which is not realistic. It's much more metaphorical. And so I've had you watch some videos on Roman sculpture and the carvings. And so we have this very hyper realistic image of this gentleman right here. And then, and I'm sorry, I forgot who this is. I'm not sure if we know. And then we have on the right a much later carving of Constantine. So this is actually a massive head. It's part of a massive sculpture that no longer remains. All we have is the head. And you can see here that it's a lot more cartoony. The eyes are much larger. They're not realistic. The features are exaggerated. And so what happened here? We're going to see a massive shift in what is important. Sculpture becomes almost metaphorical instead of being actual portraits. The eyes are emphasized because, of course, here the emperor wants you to know that he is watching you. There is also a decline in the scales. We're going to see what happens in the West. There is a collection of calamities that happen, among them famine and plague, that really and invasion from those barbarians we were talking about earlier, that are really going to decimate the population. And when you have that sort of population, they're not as focused on creating and sharing the skills for making artwork. And so we're going to see the ability to create those hyper realistic sculptures is really going to be lost in the West. And instead, there's going to be an embracing of a different type of artwork that we're going to look at next unit. So I'll leave you there. I hope you enjoyed the documentary I'm going to show you. It talks a lot about engineering, which is not my specialty. So I'll leave that to the video. All right, I will see everyone next week.